Hi, I'm Matt Van Vliet. I'm here with Kevin Smith.
Hey, Matt.
Today we're talking about when you're building a transformation roadmap, what are the five key things to consider to make sure the technology aspects of your transformation are covered? When we do a transformation at Leading Agile, we do a, a phase called define the end state. And what that does is sets up what's the plan for the transformation? What are the slices we're going to work through transforming of the organization? And what are the targets for the different capabilities and applications? Ultimately, one of the key deliverables is a roadmap that says here's where we want to go as an organization in order to do this transformation. From a technology perspective, we find five key aspects that during the define the end state we want to look at for each of the key capabilities or applications in order to make sure we've got all the right technology components in the transformation roadmap. Those five things are workforce, automations, infrastructure, architecture, and dependencies. So now what we're planning to do today is just walk through them one by one, talk about them, and make sure that you have a common understanding of why these things are important and what to worry about when you're doing your transformation roadmap.
So, Matt, why is it important to
But
have technology in the roadmap at all?
yeah, so one of the things we find is if you only transform the people and the processes and the systems of how work flows to the team, you're going to have some dependencies. You're going to have things that slow the organization down. Ultimately, you're doing your agile transformation because you want to have higher quality or increased ROI or more throughput. So there's reasons that you're doing your transformation. And if you have a lot of legacy technology, or you have um, even new projects that you're trying to build, you need to make sure that your technology is supporting and accelerating your transformation, not holding it back.
Right, and I think
That's,
in this
I'm
might be a
glad you
separate
slowed me
talk.
down.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say this might be a separate
Go ahead.
talk, but one of the things in doing a technology assessment and putting it in your roadmap is, not everything is necessarily going to base camp 3 or 4 or 5, but knowing the systems and areas where you need to deal with a higher pace of change, or you're dealing with stability of your architecture issues, um, or where you have super high value to the organization from a capability perspective, and then identifying capabilities within that matrix that need to be high value, or that are high value, that need a high pace of change, that need stable architecture, and focus on those areas for the technology aspect of your roadmap.
Right. So our roadmap's going to talk about both technical things and non-technical things that are needed to help get the organization where it wants to be. So, but today we'll focus in on some of those technology things. The first of which is workforce, which it's interesting that we started with technology and then we went to people directly. So, Kevin, why is workforce a key aspect of when we're looking at the roadmap?
Yeah, it has to do a lot with that pace of change aspect that I was talking about. If you're trying to develop a capability in-house where you need a high rate of change, there's a high rate of change in these systems, that's going to be pretty difficult to do in a outsourcing or offshoring capability. So you want that knowledge and that ability in-house to match the rate of change that you're trying to do in these systems.
Yeah, so different, and when we look at these things for the roadmap, we start with where are you, right? How many teams do you have? Are the people insourced and out or outsourced? What type of partnerships do you have in place? And what we're looking for is then for the systems, in the to be model, what is, where are they at? Like Kevin mentioned, are they, in the upper right hand quadrant where they need to be highly innovative and, um, and be, adaptive to the market, or are they in the lower left hand quadrant where they need to be just predictable and really you want to get that service for a minimal cost, right? It's just not a differentiator for you. So we want to make sure that we know what the as is workforce is. And if the to be is different, for example, there's some areas of your business that used to be just a cost of doing business, but now they're the area where you're going to differentiate and innovate. We want to make sure that the workforce plan is aligned to that. And then that in the roadmap, we have a plan, for example, to move certain capabilities from in-house to a partner, or from in-house to outsourced, or from currently outsourced but needs to be insourced, um, and have that as part of the roadmap, so that as we're transforming, we're building the right capabilities within the right organizations in order to get things done. So um, it's it's not that you're going to pick one or the other. It's that for different capabilities, you're going to have different strategies, and that the technical roadmap and the overall roadmap needs to take that into account.
So in the roadmap, from a roadmap
All right, go ahead.
perspective, it might be just a reshuffling, right? So you might have some in-house capabilities that are not focused on high value areas or innovative areas, and you've outsourced your innovation elsewhere. So it just might be a reshuffling of those as opposed to trying to build a new in-house capability.
Yep. All right. So the second aspect of this roadmap are automations. Before we talk about why they're important, what do we mean when we're talking about automations?
So there's a lot of aspects to automation. It's DevOps falls under this with pulling your testing farther to the left earlier in the development process, your pipelines, your integration, your deployments. But then there's other things too, like security compliance, standing up environments for developers, standing up environments for testing, standing up your production environments. We want to get to the point where all of that is just push button. There's not manual processes involved in doing those things. And the reason that we want to automate things is to reduce the cost of them, not just to do them faster. In the agile development, we're trying to push things to production more frequently, in smaller pieces. And if you have an expensive pipeline to get things into production, it doesn't really matter how small a batch size you have in your development process if you can't actually move that to production at a reasonable cost.
Right. One of the things to remember is that we're going to do these activities more and more often. So if you're currently deploying twice a year and we're going to go to monthly deployments, now you're doing deployments 10 times more than you did before. So if that's the case, If you do it more often at the same cost, you're actually going to increase your costs. So what we want to do is do it more often at a lower cost so that you're actually getting the benefit not just of the number of releases, but you're not increasing your overall costs. So automations, if there's something that we're doing and it's the same thing every time, we want it to be predictable and consistent. Automating it removes that from being a risky area of overhead to being almost like breathing. It's just something that's happening in the organization, and new environments are coming up, new releases are being deployed, new releases are tested. We want to automate as much as we can. And so when we're looking at building this roadmap, we're looking at, well, where are you at today from an automation perspective, right? How does it work within a team as they're integrating their code and they're testing it? How does it work once a release is ready and it gets into production? And what are all of these things today? And then where do we need to be? So if we've got these applications that maybe are going to change once or twice a year, and these other applications that are going to change weekly, we would obviously start with the ones that are going to change weekly because we'll get the best value in automating things. But where are those, and what level of automation do we need? And maybe we're over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, so that we can make sure that we're putting in the roadmap the things that are necessary to build that infrastructure into the organization, which in the end is going to make it so that the value density of your release, the amount of your release that are new features, new capabilities, things that you want to do within your applications in the market, the value density is high, and the pieces of things that are overhead and just the cost of doing business are automated away and made much easier to get done.
Right, and we talk about it from a roadmap perspective because there's no instant change here, right? You can't go from deploying quarterly to a continuous deployment where you build a feature, test it, approve it, and it's in production within hours. You can't go to that overnight. So what are the steps to get you from where you are today to a capability where you could reach continuous deployment?
Right. And one of the things we're really conscious of doing is, we're talking about a technical roadmap, and we're also talking about your base camps and what your goals are for these applications from a business perspective. We really want to tie the two together, because when you talk about DevOps or infrastructure as code, you need to know the why. Because if we know we're doing that because we need these applications to be highly adaptable and there's a high rate of change, then that helps us justify and prioritize the investments to the areas that are most important. It doesn't become just a technical thing that sounds good, but it's never able to be prioritized. If we tie it to that roadmap and we look at it from a business perspective, these are things that are going to save us money. These are things that are going to allow us to be faster than our competition, and therefore they're things that are worthy of us investing in. I just mentioned infrastructure as code, which infrastructure is the third aspect of things that we look at from that technical roadmap. So when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about, are you deployed to the cloud? Are you deployed on-prem? Do you have a mixture? Which of these do you have? And again, we're looking at what do you have today, and then where are you going, so that we can make sure that we're building the right code, the right talent development, the right capabilities into the roadmap to help get you there. Kevin, talk about how infrastructure is going to affect, how you might go about a transformation.
Right. Infrastructure doesn't just include, whether you're containerized app or cloud or serverless. It also includes, IoT devices, mobile apps, whether you're dealing with firmware on devices, um, desktop applications, all of the above falls under your infrastructure aspects of your code, and your application and how and where you're deploying it to. And, some of those things can have a pretty big impact on your timelines and how frequently you can deploy, especially if you start getting into devices in IoT, but also in mobile apps, like approval processes from App Store, from Google and Apple and things like that, factoring that into your process and pushing deployments out to app stores. So all of those aspects, have a pretty big impact on the automation levels and architecture of your application to be able to get features out the door.
Right. And Kevin just touched on it. So architecture is the fourth thing we look at when we're putting together a technical roadmap, right? Do you have legacy code? Is it a big monolith? Is it a set of services? How are the different components separated? Understanding the current architecture and then what you need that architecture to be in order to provide the capabilities that you want to in the future. And knowing that and planning for what are the architectural changes that need to happen is another piece of getting the right things into this roadmap.
Right. How much of your software is custom built versus, off the shelf configuration based software? Is it API centric today, and decoupled, or, is it this monolith batch type process? Other aspects to think about are licenses and patents, even the way the application communicates. Is it, service oriented, point to point? We've got buses and events and streams and all of these things in your application architecture today that impact how malleable your system is and how flexible it is to get new features implemented. All things that you need to consider when you're figuring out what your end state is for these innovative technologies and how you're going to go from where it is today to this desired end state.
Yep. All right, we can cut that part. Yeah. So we've talked about four key aspects, right? Workforce, automations, infrastructure, and architecture. Um, the fifth is really the most important, and it really involves partially the interplay between them. So the fifth is dependencies, and if you've heard us talk, we talk a lot about dependencies. So you may have technical dependencies between your code and other pieces of code. Once we define how the teams are supposed to be organized and the products are organized, initially we just plan to orchestrate around the dependencies. So your team is dependent on another team. How do we set up the flow of work such that we can manage and orchestrate around that dependency? To truly move quickly, we need to eliminate those dependencies or reduce those dependencies. So we want to make sure that this product can go to market without being dependent on this other product, right? So we want to make sure that they can work in a loosely coupled way, and there's always going to be coordination, but that it's mitigated as much as possible, and that could be things that drive your workforce plan or drive the need for automations of tests and mocks and things like that. It could drive how you set up your infrastructure. It could drive your architecture. But looking at how are we going to be organized, which items need to move quickly, which items will move more slowly, And then how do we mitigate those dependencies so that teams are able to control their own destiny as much as possible is essential. Um, Kevin, talk about some of the things we may put into the roadmap around reducing dependencies.
So reducing dependencies from a technical perspective, similar to Basecamp 1, when you're forming teams, you're trying to bring all the capabilities within your team to be able to release a feature. You want to try to do that within your application as well, so that the team that you've formed can add a feature and deploy it to production without a lot of handoffs to other groups. Now, it's expensive and difficult and pretty large to bring all of your dependencies into your application. So a lot of times what we're talking about from a dependency perspective on a technical aspect is isolating those dependencies. There's some cases where they are removable and you can plan it in your roadmap to pull that functionality into your team. But most cases are, how do you isolate those dependencies so you don't have a lot of handoffs with other groups? And we do that with test doubles, contract tests, characterization tests, to make sure that your team is creating software that, sorry, I'm going to start over on this one. Just on this last aspect. Give me a second here. A lot of times when we're talking about technical dependencies and removing them, we're just talking about isolating them for your team to be able to push features out without handoffs to other teams. So if you're dependent on an API from a back-end system that you don't control, can you mock it out or double it in your system so that you can test it without a dependency on the other team? Can you create contract tests for those APIs so that you can be aware of when that API is not functioning the way you expect it to for your software? So things like contract tests and test doubles is a way that we isolate dependencies for your team.
Yeah, I'm thinking of an application we're working with right now, and there's 10 plus teams working on this overall system, and one of the teams that's working on the back end APIs is actually talking to the teams and saying, you know, we have no idea which of our APIs you are using, and we don't know how you're using them. So for us to produce a new release, we don't really know how to test it without you, right? So what happened in the past was everybody went into this big, huge testing process in order to get a new version out, and where they're trying to move is to where they can build a new release, and as long as they don't break that contract with the people calling them, they can upgrade their piece without it. So one of the first things we're doing is turning the lights on to say which of these APIs are being called, and then how are they being called, such that we can put tests in place in order to make them work. And I'm going to go a little bit further, but try not to get too far into the weeds. We often, the calling party will start by putting tests in place to say, well, if this API is, I'm dependent on it, how am I calling it? How do I use that dependency? And we start by protecting ourselves from those dependencies. And then eventually we want to make sure that those tests are in the dependent systems such that the dependent system never gets to the point where it could break us. So in the end, what we're trying to do at this define the end state while we're building this roadmap is make sure that we know over the next few years where do we need to go to get um, as an organization to be able to build software, to be able to build new capability for the organization, and what are the things we need to plan for, but not just with the people and the organizational structure and the system of delivery, but also with the technology aspects. What are we doing with the architecture? What are we doing with the infrastructure? How are we mitigating dependencies? What should we automate, and how are we going to get return along the way from that automation? And then what's our workforce strategy, right? What is going to be insourced? What's going to be outsourced? And how do we plan for what we need to do with those people? Because as you can tell just from this short talk, there's a lot of things we are expecting our technologists to know and understand and help us do. And it's essential that we plan for that workforce and build the right partnerships so that we can deliver. So, Kevin, is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, just we've been talking a lot on the architecture about API usage, and that assumes that there are APIs, right? So I think a big aspect to moving architecture into your roadmap from an agile transformation is partly just becoming an API-centric organization. Becoming API-centric resolves a lot of other architecture issues by hiding them under the covers of each team and allowing teams to communicate to each other through well-defined tested contracts. So that's a big aspect
Yeah.
to being able to operate your team independently of another team.
Right. And if you have APIs and they're aligned with the way you're organizing across your teams, that helps you mitigate dependencies. APIs are some of the easiest things to automate because they're designed in a way that makes it easy to automate and even solve some of your infrastructure challenges. So, yeah,
Yep.
so making sure that you're putting those right things in place and that we're getting those aspects into the roadmap so that as we're building the capability of the organization, the technology is not holding us back, and we can really get to that point where we're able to quickly build, iterate, and innovate the things that are essential in the organization. So there's a lot more we could go into. We'll have future videos. If you have questions or comments, please share, and we'll talk to you later.